huge week for you. You have the distinguished responsibility and honor of being on the boards of both of these companies. I want to get your reaction to where the market cap landed today. Airbnb's price more than doubling. What's your reaction?
Well, Emily, thank you for having me on the show. And I think, as you saw from Brian's reaction, he was a little surprised. I think if we knew where it would land, we would have potentially priced higher. But at the same time, we don't really focus on valuation so much as thinking about, we've been partners with the company since 2009. In Airbnb's case, in DoorDash, it's been since 2014. We want to help them build enduring companies. We try to partner with them as early as possible, and then we want to help build them into category-defining companies into the future.
So would you say the same thing about DoorDash? I mean, both of these companies, both of your companies, just left a lot of money on the table. I mean, is there something in the process that is broken, or was there some sort of misalignment on price?
Well, I think, in retrospect, you can sort of second guess a bunch of decisions, but I think what you're seeing in the market is this huge receptivity to both these companies and the potential for them. They both address very large TAMs. They're in the early innings of what's possible. They're the market leaders in their business. And today, Airbnb is about Airbnb, and they have a global network effect. They're a category-defining company. They define the category that they're in, and there's really no competitor in the space like them.
Now, Sequoia partnered with Airbnb in the seed round and invested in every round afterwards. And there were a lot of naysayers at the time who didn't think people would want to rent out someone else's couch. DoorDash just a few years ago did a down round. What did you see that others didn't?
Well, I can separate the two, and I can speak to both. In Airbnb, in both cases, I guess the sort of overarching thing is just having a prepared mind, understanding the space, having Dumbo years, what my partner Doug Leone likes to call it. Be very sort of careful and listen to the entrepreneurs, and then dreaming with the entrepreneurs. And in both cases, those were true. But in Airbnb's case, our former partner, Greg McAdoo, was doing a landscape about timeshares and vacation rentals. That landscape didn't lead to a direct investment in that space, but then it prepared our minds when we heard the pitch from Airbnb. We just found that Brian, Joe, Nate just have a very differentiated way about thinking about the world. Whereas everybody was trying to sort of put travel into a commoditized space, they wanted to sort of create authentic experiences. And even back then, they believed it was a better way to travel, so that you don't have to travel like a stranger, and then you can belong anywhere. The belong anywhere came a little later, but all along the way, they felt like this is a more authentic way to travel. In DoorDash's case, I've always been fascinated, because I grew up in New York City. I've always been fascinated by the fact that New York City has a lot of things that San Francisco doesn't have. Now that I live in San Francisco, whether it's just a very, very efficient public transportation system, a great taxi network, and food delivery. And I was like, why doesn't San Francisco have food delivery? And we had actually met every single company in the space, from Grubhub to Postmates to Caviar. But we waited until we found Tony, Andy, and Stanley. And there's a combination of both having a strategic mind as well as being willing to operate in the very finest level of details. They've always thought about this as having a differentiated strategy by focusing on merchants first and then on suburbs. And so they just went where other people weren't willing to go.
Now, earlier this year, Sequoia sent a much talked about memo to entrepreneurs where you warned them to conserve cash, potentially cut jobs, called the pandemic the black swan of 2020. Fast forward, you've had a huge year. Tech has had a huge year. Andreessen Horowitz, Scott Cooper over there threw a little shade on that note you sent several months ago, saying winning investment strategy when a prominent venture firm, particularly one named after a tree, publicly announces that the world is coming to an end, go long. Do you think Sequoia got that anything in that initial memo wrong, or was that the right call?
Well, Emily, you and I talked when the memo was published, and it was a very different time when we talked back then. People were rightfully concerned. We had seen what happened in China because we have offices in China and in India. We're a global partnership. We see these things before they happen, and it was very disruptive in India and in China. And it was very disruptive in the United States, and markets did crash, and sort of companies had to reassess. And our best companies all took some time, stopped, reassessed what was going on, became hyper vigilant about the facts on the ground. And then they thought about what they needed to do. They critically sort of planned out what they needed to do to get out of their situations. And for all those companies, you're able to break, assess, and accelerate out of the turn. And that's an important lesson from the Black Swan memo. And by the way, I don't think the memo was laid out in a way that asked questions. It didn't actually ask you to do anything that you talked about.